Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My first guest is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, a former Assistant Treasury Secretary for the United States government. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Haven't spoken to you for a while. How have you been?
I've been fine, Norbert.
And busy, as I know.
Yes. And I congratulate you on your radio show.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, we've done quite a work for last year. As you know, you knew when we were starting last January, so it's quite interesting. Now, the thing I wanted to talk about tonight is a U.S. involvement in the Ukraine situation. Now, you know me. I don't want anyone to call me a conspiracy theorist. Is there any chance that there is no U.S. government involvement in the situation in Ukraine?
No, of course not.
Made you laugh.
Yeah, no. This was a coup orchestrated by Washington. It's well known. The Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, has admitted that Washington spent $5 billion creating agitation and protest groups in Ukraine in order to bring Ukraine into the European Union and into NATO. Washington has been trying to capture Ukraine ever since 2004, when the first Washington attempt, the Orange Revolution, failed to deliver the Ukraine. So in the 10 years since, they've spent $5 billion, that's $5,000 million, financing groups in Ukraine. And when the Ukrainian government decided that it was not in the economic interest of Ukraine to join the EU, because the economy was so involved with Russia, and it was the only real way for the Ukraine to exist. At that time, Washington unleashed the protests that were quickly taken over by extreme right-wing elements who introduced violence into the protest, who overthrew an elected government. And Ukraine now has an unelected government that represents a few small vested interests, oligarchs, and Washington.
Now, as you know, Yanukovych was no saint, so it wasn't a great deal, to get the people out into the streets. I think they could trick easily the population, to go out. But what do you think?
Well, few politicians are saints. And it didn't really have anything to do with whether or not he was a saint. It was Washington's intent to capture the Ukraine, put it into NATO so that Washington can put missile bases on the Russian border. Washington also hoped to be able to evict Russia from its Black Sea naval base in Crimea. Unfortunately, Washington mismanaged the coup, and the Crimeans are voting to leave the Ukraine, where Khrushchev stuck them in the 1950s. It was never part of Ukraine.
No, well, I've heard the story that he had just too many vodkas and he gave it to them.
That's what Solzhenitsyn said. But actually, I think it was done. Of course, Khrushchev was Ukrainian, but the Communist Party of the Soviet Union stuck eastern and southern portions of Russia into Ukraine in order to water down the Nazi elements in western Ukraine that had fought for Hitler during World War II. They wanted to put Russian population into the province in order to counterbalance the Nazi-inclined elements in the west of the Ukraine.
And they are still there, aren't they?
From all appearances, they're still there. And not only that, they're now in power.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to ask you, if you are talking now about the U.S. Involvement, I listened to your Secretary of State, Mr. Kerry, and, with my Eastern European thinking, I couldn't get it. Now, did he want Russia to invade Crimea, or he didn't want them to do it?
Well,
I didn't get it. Can you explain it to us?
Yes, of course. He did not want Russia to invade until Crimea voted its independence and is about to vote to be reabsorbed in Russia. And now Kerry is demanding that Russia send in its army and stop the Crimeans from exercising their self-determination. And Kerry has said if the Russians don't follow his orders and prevent Crimeans from voting on their own future, then Washington and its NATO puppet states will impose sanctions on Russia.
Now, these sanctions, see, you're an economist and a really good one. I'd like to ask you, now, if there are sanctions, implied on Russia, now it will hurt the U.S. dollar. I think it will escalate or speed up the BRICS negotiation. It's gonna hurt the U.S. dollar. If I go further, then the only thing what I can see as a resolution for the U.S. dollar falling down is a war. How do you see this?
Well, that's exactly it. Washington is driving the world to war. Washington knows that whatever damage sanctions might do to Russia, it's very small compared to the damage Russia would suffer from losing its warm water port on the Black Sea. And so the Black Sea port, as well as the fate of millions of Russians in eastern and southern Ukraine, are far more important to the Russian government than sanctions. And Washington knows that. So by threatening sanctions is completely pointless. The whole purpose is to drive toward war, because Russia then will respond to Washington's sanctions with sanctions of its own. And the Western media will stress the Russian imposed sanctions. They will ignore that Washington started the fight, and they will continue to demonize Russia, thus preparing the American population for war. And that's where it's driving the neoconservatives who control the government in Washington have an ideology of American hegemony over the world. And Russia, China, and Iran are in the way. And so here they see a chance to knock Russia out or to degrade its strategic deterrent by putting anti-ballistic missiles on the Russian border. They're locked onto that agenda. They're driving toward that, and therefore they are reckless and dangerous. And I'm convinced that Washington will drive this to war, especially, Norbert, now that Merkel in Germany has given up her doubts about sanctions and joined the American side. So now Europe has again failed its people. They failed in their leadership role, and Europe is enabling Washington to drive the world to war.
Now these, the German sanctions will cost them about 300,000 jobs, the Germans. But since you mentioned these neocons, They were actually, when was it? Somewhere around the time you were working for the government during the Reagan presidency. They popped up at that time, I think, and they've been trying to do this or whatever is happening for the last 10, 13 years since then. Do you remember, or could you tell us something about the time when they were starting actually popping up, these neocons?
Yes, they appeared first during Reagan's first term. They are rabidly anti-Russian. They were sort of accepted by the normal conservatives because they were so anti-Russian. But they caused a lot of difficulties for President Reagan. They got involved in the Nicaraguan controversy, and they caused so much trouble that Reagan fired every one of them.
Oh, did he?
He did, and not only that, some of them were prosecuted and convicted.
And served time as well?
But they were pardoned by when George Herbert Walker Bush succeeded Reagan. You know, he was Reagan's vice president. He was elected when Reagan's second term ended. And this Bush, the father of George W., pardoned the neocons who had been convicted. And they didn't really make a comeback until the second term of the Clinton regime.
Yes.
They were behind the American NATO attack on Serbia and the theft of Kosovo from Serbia. And then they emerged in total control in the George W. Bush administration, and they are still in control of the Obama administration.
So it doesn't matter whether the Democratic or the Republicans are, Democratic Party or the Republicans are actually in the Congress or whichever president is there, they are still in power.
Right. It doesn't matter who is there. You see, the National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, is a neocon. The Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who planned and organized the American coup in Kiev, she is a neocon. She's married to another neocon, Robert Kagan. Samantha Powers is also a neocon, married to another neocon. So the principal players in the Ukrainian takeover by Washington are neoconservatives.
All right. Now, do you see any similarities between Kosovo and Crimea, let's say?
No. Not, you see, we stole Kosovo. We did it. We stole it. Washington stole it. In Crimea, the people themselves are traditionally Russian. That was an area of Russia that Khrushchev stuck into the Ukraine. And when this coup government emerged in Kiev, they started making very threatening statements to Russians. They banned the use of language. They destroyed Russian war monuments. And it made the people in Crimea say, we don't want to be part of this. So they took their fate in their own hands. Russia didn't do anything. The Crimeans voted to end the association with Ukraine, and on Sunday, they're going to decide whether to stay an independent country or to join back to Russia, and the polls show it will be an overwhelming vote to rejoin Russia. So in that sense, they're totally different.
Doesn't Obama say that the Crimean,
yes, he does.
Crimean vote is not legal?
Yeah, that's what he says, but what he is saying is it's okay if the Americans steal provinces from countries and set them up as puppet states, but it's not legal for people to exercise self-determination. Well, of course, Obama's lying through his teeth. He's an idiot. He's a liar. What he says is totally false. Everybody that knows anything knows that it's totally false. Under the UN rules under the International Court of Justice, Crimea is totally legal to determine its own fate.
Now, if you could have a crystal ball in front of you, or according to the analysis what you've done, what do you think, how it's going to play out, the situation? Because all the sanctions and everything what the neocons are doing now will hurt the United States, and it will hurt badly.
Yes, but you see, it doesn't matter to them.
They don't care.
They don't care. What matters to them is obvious. I've already told you, Norbert. What they want is to weaken Russia. They want Russia unable to stand up to America, unable to get in Washington's way in Syria, unable to get in Washington's way in Iran, and they want to break up the BRICS before they can form an independent currency unit and dump the dollar. So they're after American power, American hegemony over other countries.
Do they think they will succeed?
Of course, well, I don't know. It's going to go to war. I think there'll be no winners. It's going to be World War III, because once Washington starts this war, neither side can afford to lose. And so nuclear weapons will be used. So what you have are insane people in Washington driving the world to World War III, and you've got insane leaders in Europe enabling Washington to take this step. All Merkel had to do was say no to sanctions. That would have been the end of the crisis. Instead, she gave in to the bribes and the threats and lined up with Washington. So it's just like World War I. You can sit here and watch what's happening, and you can see it's leading directly to war, and everybody is full of delusions.
All right. Now, do you think they think that they can contain a nuclear war in Europe and in Asia, and that it wouldn't touch the United States at all?
They think that they can win nuclear war. They think that
it's going to cost American lives as well, millions of them.
Well, I don't think they care, but they don't believe that. Recently, there was a paper published by two of them who say that Russia's capabilities are so backward compared to America's that we can very easily have a first strike nuclear attack on Russia, and they...
Hello? Dr. Roberts, I lost you.
Dangerous things. Now, they don't intend for the war to start right now. They want it to start after they've captured Ukraine, after they have the anti-ballistic missile bases on Russia's border to match the ones in Poland and to match the ones they're going to put in Georgia when they stick Georgia into NATO, so that Russia is totally surrounded by ABMs. And they hope then that what the result would be is that Russia would simply decide that it wasn't in a position to stand up and accept American leadership. I think what will happen instead is that in the Ukraine, Washington will push the issue so hard and so fast that the war will start before they expect. And that is a danger. If people in the world had any awareness, they would be in the streets violently protesting what Washington is doing, because what Washington is doing is clear. They are driving the world to war. It's not a question of sanctions and 300,000 jobs, that's all irrelevant. We're going to what the real issue is, we're all going to be blown up, vaporized, because Washington is in the hand of a bunch of insane criminals. Look what they've done in the 21st century. How many countries have they destroyed already? Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya.
Yeah, if you look at Libya, it's 100 times worse than, under Gaddafi.
Well, of course. They're continuing this violence everywhere. Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, They now have an Africa command. They've got American troops in Africa. They're conducting NATO exercises all along Russia's borders as we speak. They're crazy. They're insane. And everybody's sitting there delusional, like, oh, these wonderful Americans, they saved us from communism.
All right, look.
You've got no idea what's going to happen to you.
I do understand what they want and who they are, but what I don't understand is, look, I know hundreds, thousands of Americans. Americans are great people, and they are actually, some of them are, most of them are as brainwashed as we are. But what about the American public? Don't they see what's happening?
No, they have no source of information.
Oh, all right. So the mainstream media are brainwashing them as well.
Of course, the official line here, all you hear from the print or TV media is that Russia invaded Ukraine and stole Crimea.
Oh, that's what they claim.
That's what everybody believes. That's what they're told every day, all day long.
Well, we are, we have a border with Ukraine, so they cannot say that here, but the propaganda is, very similar here as well. See, we are in NATO as well, so...
yes, of course, you're an American puppet state.
Yes, we are. I'm sorry.
That, too, is a violation of the American agreements with Russia. The U.S. government told Gorbachev that it would never take NATO into Eastern Europe, but now all of Eastern Europe's in NATO.
Yes.
So everything Washington says is a lie. You can't trust anything they say. And they've been driving toward reducing Russia to an impotent state that has to accept Washington's orders ever since the Soviet Union collapsed.
Now, do you think all this thing was premeditated, since Ukraine was the third most powerful nation regarding nuclear power, and they disarmed Ukraine? Do you think this was a premeditated move for whatever is happening now?
They have been determined to weaken Russia ever since Reagan left the White House.
All right.
Because Reagan's view was we're going to end the Cold War, end the conflict, and go on about our business. But after Reagan left, 3 years after he left office, the Soviet Union collapsed. And then the government in Washington said, oh, look, now we can take advantage of this and achieve our hegemony over the world, because the constraint on our power, which was the Soviet Union, has collapsed. So let's quickly break up the Soviet empire and let's surround whatever survives with military bases. And we don't care what agreements Reagan made with Gorbachev. They're both out of office. And that has been going on since 1991. And as I've already told you, since 2004, when the American orchestrated Orange Revolution failed in Ukraine, the Washington government has spent $5 billion subverting the Ukraine. They've got all kinds of NGOs, non-government organizations in Ukraine, which organized dissent and dissatisfaction and built propaganda for joining the European Union. And that's been going on now for 10 years, and it's now partially succeeded. The outcome remains to be seen. The real crisis will come in eastern Ukraine, because it's also Russian. And if violence is used against the Russian population in eastern Ukraine in order to stop their protest against Kiev, that will bring in the Russian army.
Unfortunately. Dr. Roberts, if you could spare like 5-6 more minutes, I've got some questions from our listeners, if it's all right.
Okay.
Yeah. Mario says, "Good evening. Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts, for interview in Slobodny Vysielac radio. Many thanks. I have two questions. The first question is there an involvement of the U.S. government in the mass media and manipulation in the United States?"
Yes. The independent U.S. media ceased to exist in the last years of the Clinton regime. The Clinton regime permitted 5 mega companies to consolidate the entire American media.
They bought up little radio stations, everything, little small papers.
Everything. They were all bought up by 5 big companies. So all their broadcast licenses are dependent on the government, whether it renews them or not. So they cannot go against the government.
Oh, same here. But not us. But same here. Now,
they can,
yes?
And they're no longer run by journalists. They're run by corporate advertising executives and former government officials. So they're not run by journalists, and they don't practice journalism. They serve as a ministry of propaganda. And Gerald Celente has named them prostitutes.
Yes. It's a well-known term in our country as well.
Okay.
Now, since you mentioned the media, and since I've got you on, what happened to this redcoat who left from CNN?
I don't know.
Why did he leave?
Well, I'm not there, and I don't know the person, and so we would have to ask the person and see what that person says. But real journalists are frustrated because they can't report. They have to give propaganda. And so, I mean, this didn't just happen all at once because, there are certain people with status and prestige, and you have to silence them slowly. You can't just all of a sudden silence them, but they've been silencing them now slowly since 1997, 1998. And now it's impossible, and there aren't any more journalists. The ones that are still there can't take it anymore and leave.
All right. Well, what I heard about Piers Morgan was that, the ratings went down rapidly. So,
who knows? I mean, it doesn't matter about Piers Morgan. What matters is that the West doesn't have an independent media. It has a ministry of propaganda, and they follow Washington's line.
Yeah. Now, the second question from this listener is, how deep is Zbigniew Brzezinski's global power structure involved in the current U.S. foreign policy?
There's a difference between Brzezinski and the neocons. Brzezinski is Polish. He hates the Russians. And he goes back to the Cold War era, where the whole struggle was how we could somehow outwit the Soviets and constrain them in some way. Well, that's different from the neocons, which is we don't have the Soviets, and so that releases us to establish our hegemony over the entire world. So Brzezinski wanted to break up the Soviet Union. The neocons want to have the whole world in the same puppet state role as all of Europe is. Who does a German chancellor report to? The German people? No, she reports to Washington. Who does your government report to? Do you think your government is independent and sovereign? No, it reports to Washington. They want the same, that's what they want China to do. They want Russia to do. They want Iran to do. And that's what they're striving for. So even though the Brzezinski views are compatible with the neoconservative ones, in many ways, the neoconservative ones, though, go far beyond them. They're not just directed at breaking up the Soviet Union or just breaking up Russia. They want the whole world in their pocket. It's an empire. They see it, what do the neoconservatives call America? America is the indispensable country, the exceptional country. This is the language of Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
This is the way he spoke of the Germans.
I didn't want to say it, but yes, you are right.
And, well, it's obvious, Norbert. It's just totally obvious. They speak the same. So instead of the Germans being the chosen race, it's now the Americans. They are exceptional. They are indispensable. And what that means is they don't have to obey law. They don't have to pay any attention to international law or even to their domestic law because they are above law.
See, but what the history shows us, Roman Empire, Napoleon, Hitler, they will all, or they have all ended up, really badly.
Well, that's right, but you see they had strong opponents. Yeah. But who has strong opponents once Russia's reduced to nothing, and Iran and China? Where is the opponent?
Yeah, that's the next question from Alexander. He's asking about China. What do you think they're going to do?
They're going to do the same thing. They're already funneling money into dissident groups in China. China has a Muslim population in some areas. They are building new naval and air bases. They're surrounding China in the Pacific with new naval and air bases. They will control the straits through which China's trade flows, through the resources, and they will gradually try to cut China off from energy resources. One of the reasons they overthrew Gaddafi was to destroy China's energy investments in oil in eastern Libya. One of the reasons they're after Iran is that China gets 20% of its energy from Iran. So if they can bring Russia under their thumb, they can stop Russian oil going to China. So it is the same thing they did to Japan in the 1930s. They cut them off from resources. They strangle the economy in that way. That's what they'll try to do. They'll use the military bases to try to intimidate China, and they will spread trouble within China by organizing human rights groups, teaching democracy.
Yes.
They'll support the Muslim elements and encourage them toward terrorist acts. China, I think, is being rather careless. They let American banks come in. They let the Rockefeller Foundation come in and establish a university that can brainwash the Chinese students. When you're careless like this, when you're dealing with Americans, you really give them the opportunity to create enormous fifth columns within your country, and that's what China's doing. So China can fall too.
All right, Mario says, additionally, I have one more question. It seems to me like three questions, but never mind. He's asking, is there any opposition group, power in the USA, which is able to change or stop U.S. foreign policy, the current one? No. All right. The second question is there any difference between the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of foreign policy?
No.
The third question, are there any U.S. oligarchs behind the U.S. foreign policy, behind the scenes? Who are they?
Well, not in the sense of the Ukraine or Russia before Putin. The oligarchs here are mainly concerned with building bigger fortunes, and they have other ways of doing that. The oligarchs will be interested, or some of them, in Ukraine because it's a chance to loot. But we don't have oligarchs in the sense of Ukraine or Russia.
You have corporations and families.
We have corporations, but we don't have individuals capable of having their own militias, of ruling their own cities or provinces, and their money is generally tied up in all kinds of financial instruments, and their wealth is counting up the values of paper assets. It's not the same as the oligarchs that are now ruling the Russian cities in Ukraine.
What about our old friend, Schwartz George, a.k.a. George Soros? Is he involved in this now?
He might think he is, but not in any meaningful or determinate way.
So you think that the neocons are running the show now?
Of course they are, yeah. Sure. I mean, who do you, I've told you who they are. They're the National Security Advisor. Mm-hmm. They're the State Department. There's Samantha Powers. They control the media. What's left of conservative magazines are all neocon.
All right. The last question from Igor is what happened to the journalism in the United States since Watergate? At the time, the journalists actually went after the politicians, and it's not happening now anymore.
Well, I've already answered that.
Yes.
I said that in the late 1990s, the Clinton administration permitted 5 huge companies to buy up the media and consolidate it. And it no longer is in the hands of journalists. It's in the hands of former government officials, corporate advertising executives. The companies are huge, and their values are due to their broadcast licenses that are issued by the federal government. So if they go against the government, their licenses aren't renewed, and the hundreds of billions of dollars that the company represents goes away to zero. So they can go from being worth $100 billion to zero. And so
without
they
the license, yeah.
risk their wealth by going against the government. It's simple. It's obvious.
There is one more question from Yaro. He's asking is there any chance to turn this course around in the United States?
I don't think so. I think Putin was hoping that Western Europe would turn it around by refusing to cooperate with what obviously will lead to war. But Europe gave in to the Americans. So I don't think there's any way of stopping it at this point.
Is there any group in Congress or on the Senate or somewhere or some of the states who would oppose this course of actions?
Polls already show that the American people are overwhelmingly against the United States meddling in Ukraine. They're against sanctions. They've had 14 years of constant wars. They don't want any more, but they have no influence whatsoever on the government. The government ignores them. So
yeah. Well, when they had
the people could stop it would be if they went in the millions into the streets and sustained violent protest.
Yeah, but see, someone should explain.
Quit interrupting me.
Sorry.
They would have to be armed because the Homeland Security now has troops and tanks and would use them against the people. So essentially, the American public is defanged. It has no information. It has no organization. The NSA spies on everybody's communications of every kind. If you tried to organize something, they would pick you up. So there is don't think there's any kind of democracy or self-determination here. It's gone. There's none here. And no force exists that can stop this momentum toward World War III. It could only have been stopped by Europe. The German chancellor could have stopped it simply by saying no to sanctions. But she didn't. So just as the Germans are blamed for World War I and they're blamed for World War II, they're going to be blamed for World War III because they are what enabled Washington to push the issue into these dangerous and reckless directions. And as long as Europe enables Washington, this risk will continue to rise.
Yeah, but the American people are, by doing nothing, are risking that the war will be brought to your soil.
Well, they don't know that, Norbert. They don't know.
They don't know.
Now, I tell them, the ones that read me know, but that's not the entire population. I mean, so they don't know. They have told you already, they don't have information. The media is not telling them. The media is not saying, hey, wait a minute, this could be dangerous. They're all saying, stick it to the Russians, teach them a lesson.
What lesson? Yeah, that's crazy.
We had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff announce the other day that he's prepared to send troops. They claim that we have an agreement with Ukraine that goes back to 1992 or something, that we guarantee their integrity of their country. And so...
is there an agreement like that?
They say there is.
Have they shown you or to anyone?
Look, I don't have time to go look up all the agreements. Yeah. It won't matter, Norbert. It won't matter if they have it or not. If they want to do it, they'll say they have it.
I know.
Yeah.
I was trying to be politically correct. I know how it works, unfortunately.
Yeah. So there's not anything that I know of left to stop, unless, of course, Putin surrenders. Putin might simply say, well, I'd rather surrender than have nuclear war. Maybe that's what will happen. All right. The Russians may simply surrender. Well, and say, okay, we give up. That's about all that I can think of at this point to stop it.
All right, Dr. Roberts, thank you very much for your time. If you could stay on, I would like to talk to you off air, and I hope you would join us in the future.
Oh, okay, Norbert, I'll be glad to join you in the future, but I must really go now.
All right.
So email me, and
all right, I'll talk to you later.
Talk some other time when you're not having your show.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.
You have a good day. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Tak, to bol Paul Craig Roberts, bývalý námestník ministra financií Spojených štátov. Tí, ktorí ste rozumeli, viete, čo je, tí, ktorí nie. V blízkej budúcnosti preložíme celý tento rozhovor. Dáme si veľkú prestávku teraz, lebo ja sa musím odpojiť a zase napojiť na pána Korála a po veľkej prestávke, po nejakých 7-8 minútach sa vrátime najskôr s pani Mezenskou a potom budeme pokračovať.
Túto reláciu počúvate vďaka vašim dobrovoľným príspevkom. Ďakujeme za vašu podporu.